Intensifies with Biden said to have interviewed Lael Brainard. Jay Powell has a serious contender for the top job. The Fed warns of risky asset prices. Its financial stability report flags concern about stablecoins and Chinese real estate. Meanwhile, Bitcoin hits a record high. Over at the ECB, Christine Lagarde says the central bank is confident the current higher inflation is transitory. In Ria, if you have any questions for any of our guests, IB plus TV Go, or you can always tweet at me directly. Now, let's also take a look at the futures. We're about a minute away from when they start opening. Again, the focus is really on some of the inflationary pressures. We also look at the price of oil. I hear more and more calls saying that WTI and also Brent is on the way up. We have some strategic concerns about the strategic reserves in the U.S. That will also depend on the medium-term outlook that we get from the EIA. So overall, we're seeing a bit of pressure on these futures. I always keep an eye on UK now, a couple of days. And then equity indices, the CAC, the FTSE, the IBEX over in Spain, down some 0.2, 0.3%. The focus firmly on what's happening, of course, with the Fed. We now understand that Lael Brainard is a serious contender. We also understand through media reports that the president will make that decision for a while. But certainly some of these sovereign bonds and some of these equities to stabilize for the moment. For example, euro, dollar 115.95 and British pound 135.67. Remember, it was gilts that started the promise of a hike. And so we continue looking at the UK together with Brexit. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg Business Flash. Here's Laura Wright. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Francine. The Fed is warning that risky asset prices keep rising, making them more susceptible to crashes if the economy takes a turn for the worse. Its twice-yearly financial stability report says a change in investor sentiment or setbacks in containing the pandemic would make asset prices vulnerable to significant declines. It listed stablecoins and fragility in China's commercial real estate sector as two key threats. SoftBank shares soared on plans to repurchase nearly $9 billion of stock, a familiar strategy for founder Masayoshi. Since the repurchases ran out, SoftBank shares have slid more than 40% from their March peak. AB Foods says it expects significant progress in adjusted operating profit for the full year. The owner of clothes retailer Primark has declared a special dividend as it reports. That's the Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine.
Thank you so much, Laura Wright in London. Now for a Bloomberg scoop, and the Fed Governor, Lael Brainard, was interviewed for the Fed's top job last week when she visited the White House. That's according to Bloomberg sources. Now, Brainard is regarded as President Biden's likeliest choice if he decides to replace Jay Powell, whose term expires early next year. Meanwhile, on the subject of interest rates, the Fed's Vice Chair, Richard Clarida, says that the necessary conditions to raise rates will probably be in place at the end of 2022.
If the outlooks for inflation and unemployment I summarized a moment ago turn out to be the actual outcomes, then I do believe that these three conditions for raising the target range for the funds rate will have been met by and the breadth of the global supply shock. Adverse supply shocks, are a fact of life for monetary policy. It's been a while, maybe in the U.S. since the 1950s, since you've had such a huge supply shock, good versus services, and now global commodities.
Well, joining us now is Noor Al-Ali from our Markets Live team. Noor, I have a million questions about what we should be looking at in the Fed. So first of all, how much more?
A little bit, much so. But look, this is a golden opportunity, right, for the Biden administration to really reshape the Fed board. You've got Clarida, who you've just quoted. His term ends soon. You've got also another member that just quit as well, and his term ends in December, and also now the Fed chair. And I think the question here for us is whether or not the Biden administration is really going to shake that structure of the Fed as we see here, and that's in the coming months. That's something for us to keep an eye on.
So could it be overall more dovish? Is that what, I mean, when do we find out, for example, if President Biden sticks with Jay Powell or not?
several voting members that are there. And Bullard, who's very much a known hawk, he was also talking yesterday, and he has 2 rates scheduled in next year than you would want. It's definitely going to tip those 2 members on the side, go a little bit closer to them. So I think it's something for us to keep in mind. But realistically, inflation, a big problem, something for us to consider here as they change all these moving pieces in their board.
Nora, so we also had the financial stability.
One does, but when I talk about Bitcoin, when I think about cryptocurrencies, I think about momentum trade, definitely. The more we talk about it, the more it gets hyped. And seasonality is definitely in favor of cryptocurrencies at the moment. If you look at this great function on the Bloomberg terminal, SEAG, you'll see that Bitcoin's definitely does rise everly in sight for any cryptocurrency that's there. Every time it comes up to those new highs, it comes back down a little bit more. But that's not to say that something's definitely happening there.
Yeah. Now, the other 2 things we're watching out for is, of course, oil price, which would feed into that inflation debate, and then what Beijing is trying to do on the property crackdown.
And it all ties in together. Evergrande, definitely a big story. Also, the education tech and what's happening there from reporting from other media. The thing to keep in mind for me when it comes to Evergrande is whether or not this will signify a slowdown in the country, because that means less imports, that means less commodity usage, and that's a big problem for the commodities space. That's definitely rallied this year on those demand assumptions that we're definitely going to have more costly lesson. I'll tell you that much. But so far, it seems that they're sitting aside. The PBOC has come and said, we're not going to let this spill over as we've seen.
Issues or equities, but does it hurt economic growth to a point where we could fall back into recession, or do we just worry about inflationary pressures?
I'm going to tie you back to the financial crisis in 2008. And if you look at the price of oil at the time, it was pretty high there. And then that kind of led to what we've seen there. And a lot of, though, this is something that OPEC can control 100%. They can open the floods if they want, and they can keep them there. But the oil minister came out yesterday and said from the United Arab Emirates and said no one voted for us to increase production. So oil definitely a point of concern, but quite bullish for the market at the moment, and that's also something that's really weighing on that inflation debate.
Yeah, and we'll see whether the U.S. actually does anything with their strategic reserves. Nora, thank you so much, as always. Nora Alali there from our Markets Live team. Now, this is a picture for markets. So we're 7 minutes into the European trading session. We opened a little bit lower as we're holding on to losses. I mean, they're not huge. They're pretty much flat for the DAX and the overall European stock 600. The CAC 40 paying the brunt of it, down some 0.4%. Coming up, we talk about the European banking sector. We look at some of the groups also that are moving the most. And then our Maria Tadeo speaks exclusively to the ECB's Andrea Enria on the opportunity next. And this is Bloomberg.
Engine number one was able to do on the Exxon fight, it opened a lot of people's eyes to, I guess, the power that smaller investors can have. And I'm curious as to how other people can sort of look at what you did and use that is either a template or maybe just some sort of guide as to how they can sort of approach their relationships with other companies.
We founded the company and the environmental, the climate, the social, worker data, and we simply use it to look at the valuation of companies and look at it over a long period of time. And so, investor, you own the company. You have a voice. You have a vote every year.
Yeah.
And so our approach is to use the vote and engage with these companies over time.
But that's always been the case. I mean, at least in theory.
My dad always said, if you can say no with a tear in your eye, you might be okay. And I've been crying a lot lately.
Well, welcome back to the Open, everyone. We're 11 minutes into the European trading day, and you can see, actually, we see a little bit of green. Not huge. We did open flat. That is, of course, a possible Fed chair replacement. We know Lael Brainard is in the running. We're expecting, according to media report, the President Biden to actually make the decision by Thanksgiving. Now, let's go through the main stocks that are moving. Our reporter, Lizzie Burden, joins us to check on some of these stocks on the
and chemical conglomerate is up 2.6%. It's raised its earnings forecast this morning, swung to profit, and said that sales rose, rising freight rates. We also are watching Associated British Foods. That's up 5% in the open. This is the Primark owner. It's paying a special dividend and said that it plans to expand Primark's store estate by about a third because it's down 0.4%. That's after it's announced a €3 billion investment plan in e-commerce, says it plans to triple the value of products it sells online by 2026. But the CEO this morning has warned about risks of food inflation in 2022, so we'll be keeping an eye on that this morning.
I mean, I don't know, $3 billion to triple e-commerce. They must be quite behind in how much they sell online. Thank you so much, our Lizzie Burden. Now, the ECB's Forum on Banking Supervision kicks off today. The event brings together policymakers, academics, and business executives to discuss current developments in the banking sector. Let's go straight to Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo, live in Frankfurt for an exclusive interview. Hi, Maria.
Yes, good morning, Francine. And we are joined by Andrea and Ria. Thank you so much for inviting us. You're doing a very good conference that we're going to be talking about later on. But of course, before we get to Europe, as one of the key components for banks and profitability, we had very strong U.S. earnings. In Europe, there were some beats here and there, but it wasn't as wow. Is that perhaps because it's much harder to do business in Europe than it is in the United States? That's what banks would argue?
No, I don't think so. First of all, we should be glad that we had, for the sixth quarter in a row, profits at European banks exceeding expectations, which is good. Only at the beginning of this year, the banks were so there are positive news, first of all. Banks sometimes argue that it is regulation and supervision which are constraining their profits. I don't think this is the case, indeed. We are applying the same international standards as the US are doing. Actually, if anything, the implementation in Europe has been a bit softer than in the US. And we are exchanging notes with our US colleagues very frequently, and we came to the conclusion, the shared conclusion, that supervisory requirements are in the same ballpark as well. So I think that the main driver are linked to cost efficiency, to focus on business model, to investments in digitalization. So I think that banks should focus on self-help measures to address these issues rather than complain about tough regulations.
And your message is very clear. You're saying, don't blame us. You should actually get more lean, perhaps, streamline, get more out there when it comes to digital investment. That's something that you would argue European banks are behind?
Well, there's been a long period in which the European banks seem to be waiting for the Godot of interest rate increasing and rebuilding their margins. I think that with the pandemic, they understood that they need to take action, and they've started refocusing their business model. We have seen consolidation. We have seen more investments in digital. They realized that with the let's say, remote work, not all the banks, but some are moving, and I think this could trigger a good change in the European banking sector.
And you take me perfectly to my next question. Very hard against this idea saying the conditions are not there yet. It's probably not going to happen. The market believes something different, at least for the time being. How does that factor in the banking conversation? Because banks are salivating for this. They already feel the environment is changing, and it's changing in our benefit. How do you see that from a regulatory perspective?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that the low interest rate environment has been, until I think, more than compensated for the negative effect on margins. It is true that in the last period, the margin effect has been prevailing, so there is a negative effect on bank margins, but this is likely to stay for a while, to persist for a while. So maybe considering consolidation, to try to build sustainability in their business model rather than waiting for something from the outer space that could help them out.
The outer space. And, this year overall, and I know we have 2 months to go, so a lot can happen. The overall picture, are there any pockets that perhaps you look at some red flags as something that potentially could be a problem going forward? Some say perhaps leverage loans could be one of those pockets out there for banks.
Well, look, first of all, I would not say that, let's say, lack of scandals is a success of supervision. I mean, I think that this is really a responsibility of the bankers. I think that bankers need to, take this seriously and change the culture from tone from the top to the governance, to the middle management, remediating concerns that we have raised in these areas of culture, of governance, of business conduct. So there is still some way to go. If you read, for instance, the report of Credit Suisse on Archegos, which I think has been a very candid report, it shows that sometimes business and the competitive position of banks still prevail on internal controls. And this is a concern for me. And you're right, especially in this moment, if there is a sudden change in interest rates or in credit spreads, this could maybe hit the banks hard. So it's important that they focus very much on risk controls at this moment.
And of course, I have to ask you too, very much in the news, once again, is Monte Paschi di Siena. I know that this is something that's now with the Commission and the Italian government to try to find a buyer for this thing before the end of the year. Institution that becomes more systemic.
Look, European banks have made a lot of progress in terms of reducing risk. I mean, there has been a lot of focus on risk reduction. We had a high legacy of non-performing loans. This has been reduced, and even during the pandemic, there have been continuous securitization, sales of non-performing loans. So the risk profile of the banks has improved. The capital position of the banks is improved. The stress test this summer showed that there is resilience in the system. Can we be totally, relaxed about that? No. We still need to see the exit from the support measures of financial markets. We see a lot of leverage, concentration risk, exposures to non-bank financial institutions there, which are a concern from my point of view. So we need to still be alert and focus very much on credit risk. But let's say the situation of the banking sector at the moment.
Still in that conference that you're hosting, President Lagarde will also be speaking today, so we'll keep a very close eye on that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I look forward to our conversation this afternoon.
Very
good.
Francine?
Maria, thank you so much. Maria Tadeo there in Frankfurt with an interesting and important interview with Andrea Enria. Now, coming up, Bitcoin jumps past $68,000 for the first time. We talk cryptos next. This is Bloomberg.
Just finishing what you were saying, Tom. November 3rd is when the decision is. Just in case people got music and the Academy Awards. Is this it? Do I thank my mum again? Are you in charge of this?
Is she the only one?
Kill the music. You know who's in charge here.
Right now, about half of U.S. households invest. We'd like to get that number up to 95+%. Investing should be
at the moment. Can you walk me through how challenging that is at the moment? How difficult is it to find the right people?
Well, things have changed. Again, the world has changed under the pandemic, and you all know worldwide, what the challenge is with getting people back into the workforce.
Welcome back to the Open, 24 minutes into the European trading day, and this is what we're looking at across the board. A bit of pressure actually easing off with the European stocks now pretty much flat, but we are seeing a little bit of green. The DAX actually getting some 0.1 at 16,072. in value. Well, joining us to discuss all of this is our great Bitcoin watcher. He's a man I go to for Bitcoin and crypto insight. He's our Eddie van der Walt from our Markets Live team. Eddie, I love speaking Bitcoin with you because you always have a different angle. So what exactly at this moment is sending Bitcoin to a record?
Look, you can really feel it. It is palpable. The excitement is back in Bitcoin, right? There was this sense in the middle of the year where it was, it was just tapering out, we heading for another crash and so on. But that's just no longer the case. And I think, it's always hard to put a pin in exactly what it is that's driving Bitcoin prices. But over the weekend, when Elon Musk started tweeting about selling 10% of his stake in Tesla, there was this momentum that got behind Bitcoin because people started thinking, well, maybe he put some of that money into Bitcoin, into cryptocurrencies more widely. Of course, he likes Doge more than anything else. But really, anything that Musk would be able to put in, even if he put his pre-tax gains from the sale into cryptocurrencies. So really, this is
greater volatility and possibly danger. Is there anything new in that?
I think we are getting to the point. A year or so ago, when we were talking about this, we said, look, cryptocurrencies are really interesting. They are spectacular. They run up, they crash, but they are not systemic, right? And if there's a run on these stable coins that they start to have to sell, that could have repercussions for the whole of the rest of the market. And the regulators in the US, they have realized this, and that is why they're starting to put pressure on it. But it's not sapping the excitement out of the crypto space at the moment.
Eddie, thank you so much. Our Bloomberg's, you can find it on TLIV Go. Coming up, Indonesia's Alpha GWC Ventures closes record-setting fund for a Southeast Asia startup. So we speak to the firm's co-founder, Jeffrey Zhou, about that next. This is Bloomberg.
Проходим опасный участок, ответственный.
Очень много думал о том, что я сделал, и понял, что я через это прошел. Состояние, наверное, организм истощен, потому что очень много физической работы. Своим вот этим поступком.
We're in London, in Sydney,
in San Francisco.
9 a.m. in Beijing and Shanghai. Good morning, everyone.
Have a great evening. So recap the headlines.
You do not want to miss this story. How are you thinking about those dynamics?
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Welcome back to the Open, everyone. 30 minutes into the European trading day, and here are your top stories. The race for Fed chair intensifies, with Biden said to have interviewed Lael Brainard about stablecoins and Chinese real estate. Meanwhile, Bitcoin actually hits a record high. And over at the ECB, Christine Lagarde says the central bank is confident that the current higher inflation is transitory, while Philip Lane says it would be counterproductive to tighten policy now. So let's look at the markets. And I have to say on that report about Lael Brainard being interviewed at the White House, Treasuries rode with shorter maturity leading gains following this report that she was interviewed. Some commentators see her as a little bit more dovish than Jay Powell. Now, the picture today for the markets today. So futures pointed to a lower start by about 0.3%. Again, they look at inflation. They're looking at some of the earnings. A bit directionless, I think, as we probably wait for, central bank policy. The inflation, a lot of the focus also is on oil and then the strategic reserve that the U.S. could release. Now, this is some of the stocks and some of the 0.7%, retail, media, and real estate, the ones that are feeling the most pressure. Energy, after a nice bounce back yesterday, utilities, banks, and 0.7% or losing 0.5%. So no huge swings or big moves. Now, Indonesia's Alpha JWC Ventures has closed its third Southeast Asia fund at a record $433 million to back early-stage tech startups. Now, the fund has attracted regional and global investors, including Morgan Stanley and the World Bank's International Finance Corporation. Well, joining us now is Jeffrey Joe, things that are valuable or that the country as a whole has a long way, has a lot of potential and investors are just clocking onto it now.
Yes, thanks for having me, Francine. So we really believe that this is a really exciting time for us in Indonesia and also in the Southeast Asia region, broader region. A lot more unicorns are actually coming from the region. And that is basically the market has getting more mature. And also we see that a lot of good companies that's really generating revenue, meaningful revenue, that's really backing this unicorn status in the region. So there's a lot of exciting...
the third fund has invested into some 7 companies in financial technology, for example, but also B2B servicing, for example, Indonesia, but some also of the neighboring countries. Where do you see the most value created?
So earlier this year, we produced a report about the second and third tier cities in Indonesia. We believe that currently what's driving the digital economy in Indonesia is a lot of in the bigger cities still are making, especially during the pandemic.
Jeffrey, where do you see the most opportunities going forward? So first of all, is it regional investors that are coming into the funds, or is it also international ones as they try to diversify their portfolios, but also looking for yield that's ever more difficult to find?
Yes, and we also share a bit about our performance, and we really believe that the performance that we have shared is just strengthening a lot of global investors actually coming to this region, especially what we are seeing with a couple of tensions in the world. But we believe Indonesia, Southeast Asia, is actually a very, very stable region, and we are still early in the whole internet evolution stage. So we believe that there's a lot more to grow, and there's a lot of exciting sectors, and also we see a lot of emerging founders as well that's coming into the market now.
Jeffrey, when you look at Indonesia's tech ecosystem, what more need to happen for it to make, to really go to the next leg up? Is there something that the government should be put in place, or is it really up to corporates and private businesses to make sure that the ecosystem in place is strong?
That really needs to happen before we really see a great growth and boom in the technology sectors. Number one is the strong founders, and a lot more stronger founders coming not only from abroad, but also coming from some of the large technology companies. So we are seeing very positive development here. Number two, the fundamentals of the companies are actually getting stronger. So like I mentioned earlier, the revenue generation is actually getting stronger. So like you mentioned, we just witnessed one of the largest IPO in Indonesia Stock Exchange for technology companies, which is Bukalapak. It's a lot more global and institutional investors, and this is just increasing the testament that actually global investors are starting to see the potential in this region and have started deploying more capital into the region.
Jeffrey, thanks so much. Jeffrey Joe there from Alpha JWC Ventures. Coming up, of course, the movers that we're watching the most. First of all, we start with AB Foods. This is an important one because it's the owner of Primark. Now it's planning store expansion after the lockdown recovery. So the parent company, ABB, is what we're looking at. And it says it expects Primark to deliver much improved margin and profit this current fiscal year. It also announced a plan to raise the store total from 398 to 530 outlets over the next 5 years. Now, the other one that we're looking at for is Bayer. This is an interesting one. Gainers gaining some 2.8%, tapping Monsanto veteran to lead a crop unit amid the rebound. So investors seem to like what they are seeing. Hermes down some 2.3%. Now we're looking at some of the ones that are actually losing the most. This is probably because of some of Montclair, so it does seem we're seeing a little bit of pressure on some of these luxury stocks. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg. First Word News with Laura Wright. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Francine. Bloomberg's been told Fed Governor Lael Brainard Jerome Powell has a serious rival as President Biden considers who will lead the Fed for the next 4 years. Powell's current term expires 6 months. A government advisor says the territory must finish negotiating open borders with the mainland first. Hong Kong and China remain the only places left in the world still pursuing a COVID-0 strategy. Singapore, meanwhile, is easing some tough COVID measures put in rising, making them more susceptible to crash if the economy takes a turn for the worse. Its twice-yearly financial stability report says a change in investor sentiment or setbacks in contained fragility in China's commercial real estate sector as 2 key threats. Women and minority-led hedge funds have outperformed their peers over the short and long term. According to the Bloomberg Hedge, nearly 30%, and those with women represented returned over 21%. Funds without those attributes had a gain of less than 13% in that period. Overall, the Bloomberg All Hedge Index severely underperformed the S&P 500 over 5 years. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries.
Russia and Eastern Europe reports record infection levels. We'll have more on that next. This is Bloomberg. The energy crisis, there's a lack of drivers. Is there anything that you need to ask authorities to do better or that your clients want the UK to do better?
There are labor issues that are really a reflection of this transition out of the pandemic. There are supply chain issues. Some of this stuff is transitory. There are some secular trends, and I think leaders here are thinking about it the same way leaders are around the world.
When you look at the UK and, of course, some of these green investments that the UK and the City of London particularly has been really...
That governments around the world partner with the private sector to try to get capital directed toward innovation in a way that we can accelerate the climate transition. And I want to emphasize it's clearly a transition.
Sure that CO2 emissions are going down, which is mainly done by taxing CO2 emissions, which means, of course, increasing prices on energy at the moment, on fossil fuels, for example. So to a certain extent, states are driving those costs. On the other hand side, we have to ensure that people can afford heating in winter, for example. When I take a look over the European development of market, the price rising is one of the heaviest. In Austria, it's rising, but it's not a big problem at the moment. Meaning that if energy prices are rising over a certain percentage, then we won't implement the full increase of CO2 pricing for the next year. But also, if energy prices are falling, we will...
Mr. Gernot Blumel speaking to my colleague Alex Steele. Now, this is what the picture is like for the markets. A lot of focus, of course, on inflation. A lot of focus also in on oil. Now, we did start the day on the downside. Actually, we're seeing a little bit of a climb through for some of the equities. U.S. Treasury slipping today. Leadership of the Federal 0.4% just a short while ago is now pretty much flat. Now, some of the other things we're watching out for is the dollar falling, yen strengthening. In cryptocurrency, for example, Bitcoin jumping past $68,000 for the first time to set a new high. That's part of a broader rise in digital tokens that, of course, has taken their over.
Keep rising, making them more susceptible to crashes if the economy takes a turn for the worse. Its twice-yearly financial stability report says a change in investor sentiment or setbacks in containing the pandemic would make asset prices vulnerable to significant declines. It listed stablecoins and fragility in China's commercial real estate sector as two key threats. SoftBank shares soared on plans to repurchase nearly $9 billion of stock, a familiar strategy for the founder, Masayoshi Son, a $22 billion buyback program last year from their March peak. AB Foods says it expects significant progress in adjusted operating profit for the full year. The owner of the estate from around 400 to 530 over the next 5 years. Francine, we know Mark Cudmore loves a Primark bargain. Lizzie Burden calls it Primani. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that the kids are safe and they make everything, Laura. So I try not to buy too much fast fashion, but it depends on what the end of the month looks like in terms of, how much salary is left over. Laura Wright, thanks so much, our Laura Wright there in London. Now, Europe once again becomes a hot spot for the coronavirus, calling into question the recovery from